Lunchbar, titled "Where is the Hope in My Chaotic World?" So, as as like the other days of the week, we've got Joe coming to speak, and then we will also have a Q&A afterwards. Oh yeah, I should probably introduce ourselves. I'm Shay, and this is Rosie. So yeah, I'll.
Great, I'll take it from here. My name's Joe, if we haven't met. I come from London. I've been here a week. I've had a nice time. First time on Warwick campus. It's been a good week, hasn't it? Good weather at least. Not as smoggy and stuffy as London, so back to that kind of city air tonight. Let me read you a poem. The world is due. The world is due. And yet. That poem was written by the famous Japanese poet Issa. His 5 children died before he reached the age of 30. Then his wife died as well. And filled with questions, he went to see a wise Zen master for answers. The answer that he was given by this Zen master was simply, the world is dew. Just like the sun rises and the dew on the grass disappears, so our world is transient. Our relationships, our suffering, our lives. It's a poetic way of putting a harsh truth, isn't it? Even without adopting the whole Eastern pattern of thought, I think many of us will see some of our own attitudes towards death and suffering in that poem. It's inevitable. It comes to all of us. And yet, in the depths of his sorrow, that answer didn't make sense to Issa. It didn't adequately explain the intensity of his emotional experience. On the one hand, every human story seems to end in death, and yet, on the other hand, it feels wrong. Death, when it comes up close and personal, does not feel natural. It does not feel like a logical end. It does not just feel unlucky. It feels like an intruder. Our experiences of pain often cause us to ask the kinds of questions which our stories don't allow answers to. Why is this happening? Why does it hurt so much? Is there some kind of hope I can hold on to for the future? I'm not sure if there's ever a good time for a bird to poo on you, but there are certainly some bad ones. Last April, I stood outside a church at a funeral, head bowed in prayer, and all of a sudden, splat. Proper big one, right on the shoulder. I kid you not. It was hard not to laugh. Those around me, they saw it. They were struggling. There we stood, mourning the death of our friends, filled with deep and heavy grief. And yet, here was a reminder that the world carries on. That pigeon had no idea that my friends had died. And as I looked beyond the graveyard through the railings, I saw cars rushing past, people walking into the tube station, others walking back home carrying their food shopping. They didn't feel what I was feeling. Some of them looked through the railings with respectful expressions, pity in their eyes, but I knew that as soon as they got round the corner, they would quickly move on. Unlike the poo on my shoulder, which needed several tissues and 2 good washes at 60 degrees in order to move on. You don't need me to convince you that life can be painful. For some of you, perhaps it's even painful right now. We live in a world where illness, mental and physical, and death and suffering are just realities, aren't they? We live in a world where things hurt. And I just want to pause to say before I go any further that if that is you here today, if you're feeling that pain up close, you are so welcome. I'm not trying to manipulate you or belittle your circumstances or take advantage of you. I know that for some people, the question of suffering and hope is a philosophical debate, but for others, That feeling it's a genuine protest. Is there hope? Is a question that matters. And I guess it's from that kind of angle that I want us to think in our time together now. Our moments of hurting are often the ones which cause us to ask bigger questions, aren't they? Is there any hope when I'm face to face with the chaos that this world throws at me? Struggles come which shatter the illusion that my life is under my own control. Suddenly the universe feels much bigger and much emptier and much quieter than before. Those circumstances are the "and yet" moments in Easter's words, right? When things are going fine, we can hold on to the idea that suffering is merely an inevitable and natural phenomenon. But then it comes close and we find ourselves crying out, "And yet." And yet, what feels rational in the good times doesn't come close in the hard ones. On the other hand, there are the lines we use to ease our emotional pain in those "and yet" moments. We say things like, "I know they're up there looking down on me," or "she's at peace now." Those things that make us feel better in the moment. Or maybe we tell ourselves that the suffering of today can only get better. Tomorrow will be a better day. If we press on through or come out stronger, the future will be a happier place. We have this longing for hope, which our rational answers don't seem to provide. And so in desperation, we turn to things which deep down we know full well may not be true. So really the question that I want to ask is this. Is there any kind of story out there that makes sense both rationally in the good times and emotionally in the "and yet" moments? Is there a hope that cohesively explains my whole human experience of suffering? Alongside the Zen master, alongside others of history's greatest teachers, Jesus, who's the central figure of Christianity, offers us answers to questions of suffering and pain. As well as that, we have episodes recorded for us from Jesus' own life when he came face to face with human suffering up close. And I'm convinced that in his answers and his experience, in the life he lived, we find a real cohesive hope, real hope in our suffering. So I want to show that to you now. If you'll listen to me, I want to think together about one of those episodes from his life and just examine the unique perspective Jesus offers us when it comes to hope in our pain. It'll come up on the screen so we can look at it together. Here we go. Soon afterward, Jesus went to a town called Nain, and his disciples and a large crowd went along with him. And as he approached the town gate, a dead person was being carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow. And a large crowd from the town was with her. So picture the scene. We've got two main characters and two large crowds at the gates of this city called Nain. In one direction, heading into the town, we've got Jesus and his crowd. And in the other direction, heading out of the town, we've got the woman and her crowd. And Jesus' crowd, there'd presumably been an energy and excitement about them. They'd been following Jesus. He'd been saying quite radical things. He'd been doing some pretty impressive things. They were anxious to see what happened next. There was an air of expectation. Heading the other way, the other crowd was totally the opposite. They were silent. They were still. There was no expectation to them. Why? Because they're grieving the dead son of this woman. She's been left with no husband and no other family. She's in the middle of a real "and yet" moment. Her world has evaporated from around her. So two totally different crowds led by two different people heading towards one another on the road. And what do we find as they meet? Let's take a look. When the Lord saw her, that's Jesus, when Jesus saw her, his heart went out to her. Isn't that profound? Don't miss the significance. As far as we know, this grieving mother is a complete stranger to Jesus. As well as that, he's a busy man, he's popular, there's a whole crowd who are vying for his attention, even at this moment. He'd be well within his rights to respectfully bow his head, stand to one side of the path while they passed, and then move on. Just like the rest of the world at my friend's funeral last year, you would expect perhaps a sympathetic glance, a moment of hush, and then move on. But for Jesus, it's different. He sees this woman and he feels compassion. The original language emphasizes that this is a feeling from deep within him. He feels a powerful empathy as he sees the hopelessness and the sadness of this and yet moment. That's a man that perhaps makes Jesus unusual, right? Our reaction to these situations, they may be genuine, but they are often fleeting when the situation isn't personal to us. But Jesus, despite a lack of personal connection with the woman, responds in deep empathy. Our stories tend to play down the significance of pain and suffering. It's just unlucky. There's nothing you can do about it. It's just the way things are. But Jesus here heightens it, because rather than looking away and avoiding and retreating, he chooses to take someone else's grief as a personal burden. He has no intention of telling the woman that she was too attached to her son or that she's just been unlucky. He hurts with her. I kind of like to think that had Jesus belonged to another culture, at this point he would just have given her a hug. But what makes this especially powerful, even more so than that, is that Jesus, up until this point in Luke's gospel where we find this story, Jesus is claiming to be God himself, walking as a man on earth. And if that is the case, then what we're witnessing here is not just the reaction of one unusually compassionate man, but the reaction of God himself when faced with human sorrow and the grief of this woman. And he's not passive, he's not distant, he's compassionate. He feels it like she does. He chooses not to stand at the side of the road and watch like the rest of the crowd may well have done, but to enter into the story and to draw near. If Jesus really is God, as he claims, then the God of the whole universe is deeply moved by the individual suffering of human beings. The God of the universe hurts with you when you are suffering, because it's a violation of the way he made things to be. And he never intended any human being to experience it. The Zen master says you need to care less and be less attached. Perhaps many of us just say there's nothing we can do about it. Jesus says this is not right. He cries out against it. Isn't that what we feel in our anguish in those moments? The Bible is clear that God made a world that was full of goodness and life, with no hint of badness or death. It was finely tuned and balanced, sustained by God in perfection. He was the source of goodness and life, and the world, through connection with him, was abundantly full of goodness and life. So as Jesus, who claims to be God, comes face to face with this grieving woman and sees how far things have fallen from his original intention, he legitimately cries out against the suffering. This is wrong. This is not right. This is not how things are supposed to be. In our stories, death is natural. The world is due, and that is just the way things are. In Jesus' story, death is real and it hurts, but it is wrong. And the way our hearts protest within us is like a homesickness for a world we've never been to, and yet we seem to have an awareness of. A world untempered by the chaos. And so Jesus' story makes sense of my emotions in a way that no other story I've found does. Jesus says, this is wrong, my child. You are not made for moments like this. The reason the world is like this, Jesus says, is because we've turned our back on him, the source of goodness and life. And so in response, God says, let me show you, let me give you a taste of the significance of that. Let me show you what it means that you've walked away from the one who is the source of all goodness in life. Let me give you a taste of the death and badness that comes without me. You were made to know the fullness of my goodness, but now while some of that goodness remains, there will also be those and yet moments in which we taste the consequences of disconnection from him. This is wrong. In his novel, The Magician's Nephew, C.S. Lewis describes a child called Diggory. Many of you may have read it. This child, Diggory, has a dying mother. And Diggory comes face to face with the magical lion, Aslan, wishing that Aslan would intervene and save his mom. And listen to this quote as Diggory looks up into Aslan's eyes for the first time. What he saw surprised him as much as anything in his whole life. For the tawny face was bent down near his own, and, wonder of wonders, great shining tears stood in the lion's eyes. And they were such big, bright tears compared with Diggory's own that for a moment he felt as if the lion must really be sorrier about his mother than he was himself. That's what God feels when you suffer. We try to play down suffering, but God longs for us to see these and yet moments for what they are. Evidence of brokenness and wrongness. He wants us to wake up and realize this world is unnaturally broken and painful. But all of that would be wasted if it just gave us an awareness, right? If God simply wanted us to know that there are consequences to rejecting him, that wouldn't offer us much hope. Let's return to Jesus and the woman and her dead son. So we just read this. When the Lord saw her, his heart went out to her. Go to the next slide. Thanks. And he said, "Don't cry." There we go. Then he went up and touched the stretcher they were carrying the boy on, and the bearers stood still. He said, "Young man, I say to you, get up." The dead man sat up and began to talk, and Jesus gave him back to his mother. Throughout history, death has been the end of every human story. And yet, when Jesus is on the scene, death is not the end. Jesus gives a totally different kind of and yet moment, right? If Jesus had simply spoken about death being wrong, this kind of power over death would seem totally irrational and implausible, but he shows us that it is not just wishful thinking by proving he really has the power to intervene. He proves he has the power to bring hope in our chaos. And so one of the most powerfully profound sentences in the whole Bible, the dead man sat up, is coupled with one of the most compassionate and tender. Jesus gave him back to his mother. Death had come, and yet Jesus is greater. In our stories, death is the end. Death is bigger and more powerful than any of us. We can delay it, perhaps. We cannot escape it. We can ignore it. We cannot avoid it. And yet, Jesus is more powerful than our greatest enemy. Not only does the God who rules the universe hate human death, he also has the power to beat it. To those of us who know the pain of suffering, this is profoundly hope-bringing news. If there really is someone out there who is more powerful than death, we need him. At the same time, this makes the rest of Jesus' life even more profound. Because as we reach the climax of the biographies of Jesus, you can read them for yourself, we find the one who apparently has power over death, hanging on a cross, dying. The one who hates suffering and who never intended it, suffering. In Jesus, God himself chooses not just to stand to the side of the road while the funeral procession passes by. He chooses to enter our story. He chooses to face his own moments of pain. He chooses to come in compassion and say, this is not right. And he comes to bring the ultimate and yet to death by dying himself and by rising again. And there's a lot more to be said there. Come back tonight for the whole story where we're going to look at Jesus' own resurrection. It's powerful stuff. But God's hope in allowing suffering to continue isn't just that we would be miserable. It's that we would wake up and come back to him. It's that we will realize we were made for a better world than this one. We've rejected him and we deserve nothing from him. Yet he offers hope. And yet he offers hope. He says, now you've tasted the consequences of rejecting me. Will you come back? And to all who do, all who come back, he makes the promise that your story, though it may include death, will not end in death, but in life. That as the sun rises on your life, you'll not simply evaporate like dew. As the sun rises on your life here, you will live instead in a world restored to the way it was supposed to be. A world free from the agony of suffering. A world where nothing good passes away like dew. And the dark moments never come. This is a powerful hope. And in raising this boy, in raising himself from the dead, Jesus proves he has the power to accomplish it. My friends, I mentioned them earlier, they died last year. They were in their 20s. Both of them were school teachers. Their lives were taken from them in a moment. If there is no God, the best I can say is that they got unlucky. Well, that does not come close to capturing or explaining what I feel when I think about them. And yet, I know that I'll see them again. I will join them in a world that eclipses anything I know here. I can say absolutely what happened to them was wrong, and that though their deaths are painful, and yet they are not final. One day I'll see them again. I'll enjoy life with them again. And if you will come to God and say, God, I want that hope too. And one day I will introduce you to them. This is a profoundly powerful hope. We're going to have a Q&A time in just a few minutes. We've, over the last few days, had a 5-minute pause in this gap, but I want to sing you a song, if that's all right. A song that I wrote about my friends last year. As I wrestled with this and as I felt in my pain, God saying, this is wrong, this is painful, and yet this is not the end. So I'll sing this song. We'll take just a minute's gap after that, and then we'll have the Q&A. So feel free to text in your questions as I sing, but hopefully you can enjoy as I sing. I heard your laugh this morning, and it made me smile, just like it always did. And once again I'm thinking that it's been a while. And I miss you, my friend. Oh, they try to tell me that you're gone and that I'll never see you again. But Oh, I keep on telling them they're wrong. 'Cause we both know that when the night is over, we'll wake up under the same sun. I'll miss you on the journey, but I'll be with you when it's done. In the quiet spaces, I still feel the ache. Oh, you don't know the space you left. Now I'm stuck growing older while you stay young, fresh-faced in the photographs. And I try to keep the dust off of the memories in my head. And oh, they try to tell me that you're gone and that I'll never see you again. But oh, I keep on telling them they're wrong. 'Cause we both know that when the night is over, we'll wake up under the same sun. And I'll miss you on the journey, but I'll be with you when it's done. And I might still keep your picture with my credit cards, just like a window in my wallet with a view of the past. I'll probably shed a few more tears more often than I'll admit, but hope is my companion till I'm with you again, till the time heals all the scars that we've forgotten about, untempered by the darkness that oppresses us now, more alive and more real than we will ever have been. Hope is my companion from now until then. And when the night is over, we'll wake up under the same sun. I'll miss you on the journey, but I'll be with you when it's done. Thanks. Let's take a break for just a minute and then we'll be back for the Q&A.